Today, New Zealand is the sky tower of homelessness. We've got the lowest home ownership rates in 70 years, and we've got the least affordable housing ever, which is seriously fucking saying something considering New Zealand's been on a house price bender for decades. It wasn't always like this. 35 years ago, we congratulated ourselves on how much fairer New Zealand was compared to everyone else. The year was 1988, and 75% of us owned our own homes. Annually, 10,000 new households were getting into homes via government mortgages, and we were putting 7,000 new modest income families into state homes, where the rent was genuinely affordable every year. New Zealand likes to think of itself as a nice place, with progressive taxes and universal healthcare, etc. But we aren't. Not anymore. We're a sandpit for old landowners to buy and hold land, whilst the rest of us run around paying 30% of our income in tax, 40% on rent, 12% repaying student loans, and then save the rest to buy a broccoli, 2 bottles of cheap Cav Sav, and a creamy milk once a fortnight. Here's that story of how New Zealand's governments chose time and time again to let this happen. The big moment happens in 1991, New Zealand's housing reforms, so if you're here for a short time, not a long time, skip ahead to here. If you want the full rundown, break off a florid of that broccoli and let's get into it. What were those housing reforms? What did we look like before them? And why does New Zealand tip all of its money into housing when it is such a shitty thing to do? As soon as Aotearoa became known as New Zealand, it was always about land ownership. Settlers came over to buy their own land because they were locked out of Britain's hereditary land ownership system. They bought land cheap, cleared it, and then farmed the shit out of it. New Zealand's governments focused on providing usable land for those settlers, which mainly meant dispossessing Māori of their ancient land, providing loans, and developing basic infrastructure to now make that land work. Then World War I rips through New Zealand's young men, and soon the state needs to provide more. Income tax becomes a golden goose, being raised over 10 times during the war, but it's tolerated. It was a crisis. Everyone knew families deprived by war, and the recipients had a deserving face. Then the Great Depression of 1929 slammed New Zealand, and people got desperate quick. Enter the first Labour government and its message of a new social welfare system as a right, and suddenly the government had even more to pay for. This means two things for this story. One, the government starts building lots of houses, even for pohara. Two, we become increasingly reliant on income tax to pay for everything government related. A post-World War II consensus made politics reasonably stable, and in the 50s, 60s and 70s we built more homes than you can shake a stick at. Each decade we built one house for every 10 New Zealanders. And during that period, prosperity went through the metaphorical roof and then came back down into literal roofs in the form of home ownership. Successive governments were also financing people into those homes by providing low interest loans. 5% down, 3% interest rate, 40-year terms, boom. Basically saying, we'll make sure lots of homes get built, and we'll make it easy for you to buy them. In other words, put all your eggs in this basket. And if you tell a country to put all of their eggs in one basket, you better fucking look after that basket. And New Zealand's governments really, really have. We'll get to what that looked like soon. Let's finish the gripping tale of New Zealand's housing reforms first. So we've built heaps of homes. Home ownership is high. We're providing affordable housing, but it's still capitalism, so there's money to be made. Enter old world moneymaker Bob Jones, who in 1977 publishes a bestseller that exposes a chunk of New Zealand's newly property-owning public to how they too can make money off the poverty of others. Daniel McLaughlin's recently reread it, and he summed up the main bit of advice from the book as: investor puts up 20%, bank puts up the other 80%, investor gets 100% of the gains, and the tax department gets nothing. As compelling as that advice was, New Zealand still had these factors in its favour which kept house prices in check. A super strong and well-resourced public service that tried to plan and allocate resources for the entire country. Low-income families were provided homes at below market rent, and 38% of mortgages were low interest and loaned by the government. Unfortunately, it was right about now when all of our good work curdled like the milk in a Fonterra truck stuck in the summer sun for a month. The Chicago School of Bizarro Robin Hoods had unleashed the three-headed beast of deregulation, privatization, and social spending cuts in Chile and Argentina, and the results were almost instantaneous. Impoverishment, torture, and disappearances for the many, and soaring profits for the few. Inexplicably though, everyone seemed to think that what was happening in Caracas and Buenos Aires was a good thing, and governments like ours started hyperventilating to be the next in line to self-destroy their own economy and the livelihood of their people. The Chicago School's main dude, Milton Friedman, famously said this: "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." And well, it was during the crisis of World War I that New Zealanders tolerated huge rises in income tax, and it was the crisis of the Great Depression that changed the sheen of the Labour Party from total fucking loonies to progressive nice guys with a plan. And in 1987, we had another crisis, the global share market crash, and disastrously it was the Chicago School's ideas that were lying around. Enter the fourth Labour government and Finance Minister Roger Douglas. Public thirst for broad reform grows, and investors want an alternative to the share market as they now saw it as too risky. And that's still the case today. Mr. Douglas's proposals for the budget in 1987 were textbook Chicago School bullshit. They were: sell most government assets, like our government mortgages and state homes; extend user charges, i.e. make people pay market rate for everything; raise GST, which hits the poor hardest; and work towards a flat 15% rate of income tax, which lowers the tax rate on the rich. And so begins New Zealand's housing reforms. The government begins to move out of the way for the private market to do its thing. We're now getting basically all of our tax from income and GST, but now we want the government's assets to start producing a return too. Enter the 1991 national government that doubles down and accelerates privatisation big time. Like anything historical, there's always way more to the story, and they did have major foreign debt that started costing an arm and a leg that they needed to pay for somehow. But unfortunately for them, history doesn't remember which bills you paid, it remembers who you kicked out onto the street. They sell off $2.4 billion worth of government mortgages, giving banks a taste for how much profit can be made from a privatised mortgage market, and they replace income-related rents for state tenants with market rents. State tenants had been paying 25% of their modest income as rent. They were now all of a sudden forced to figure out how to magically come up with a lot more. At the same time though, the national government was eviscerating welfare payments, deregulating the labour market, and forcing the newly minted Housing New Zealand to start paying a dividend. We went from looking after our state tenants to milking them for cash. Remember that 75% home ownership stat that I led with at the beginning? Well, that starts getting used against us too. The free market's ultimate goal is even more Bob Jonesy than Bob Jones himself. It wants as much money as possible flowing to those that already have money. Those homeowners start using their main asset to leverage themselves into property investment, and the banks were all too happy to pile drive money into property. That's how you got all these mum and dad investors that you've heard so nauseatingly much about. Throughout the early 2000s, that's what we did. We pumped money into the housing market. Then there was the GFC, when we stopped for a bit. Then we dropped interest rates close to the floor. Then we pumped even more money into the housing market. And then COVID hits and we stopped for a nanosecond, and then we put interest rates actually on the floor and we pump more intensely than ever. During the 2 years of COVID, house prices rose by 43%. So New Zealand's governments have done an excellent job of looking after that basket with all those property owners' money in it. Here are the big three things that they did/didn't do. They didn't put a tax on the gains from property, they allowed property to offset personal income tax, and the main one, let the banks go fucking absolutely, totally bananas, methamphetamizing everyone's equity via leverage. Despite pretty much everyone saying, you need to put a capital gains tax in to make sure that we didn't start over-investing in property, New Zealand's governments have never put one in. Tax on the gains from property in New Zealand has been pretty much non-existent. As Moneymaker Bob said, you keep all the gains and the taxman gets shit. We also allowed property investment to offset other income via negative gearing. So you buy an investment property using debt, make a loss on the rent versus the cost to serve that debt, i.e. interest rates, offset that loss against your personal income every year, and all the while luxuriate in the knowledge that the underlying value of that asset is going up and that you'll pay no tax when you decide to sell. This was big for a while. I remember talking to my mum about this, and she remembered when she was working at some of the big law firms and wondering why all the partners loved kiwi fruit so much. Well, there was only green kiwi fruit at that time, so no one could have loved kiwi fruit that much. They were using those orchards to shelter their high incomes from high tax rates by putting their money into land that didn't have any tax. But the big one, in terms of New Zealand's current crazy town scenario of $1.7 trillion worth of residential property versus $170 billion worth of share market value, the most upside down in the OECD, is government sat back on the deregulation sideline and watched as the banking system reoriented to pretty much solely focus on pumping up the property market. Look at how bank profits and home lending have changed from 92 to 2021. Bank profits have multiplied over 20 times, mortgage lending almost 15, whereas GDP per capita and even the house price index, that is, the main insanity of this video, only rose by a bitch-ass 4 and 7 respectively. As a cool dude Paul Carew recently said, New Zealand doesn't have a housing supply problem. We have a housing distribution problem. New Zealand's housing reforms turned houses into commodities, and they're owned by investors that want to make money from them. This is where a huge chunk of the demand for property comes from now. The property owning class of New Zealand has a monstrous whack of wealth. There's only mortgages on about 18% of New Zealand's entire housing stock, that 1.7 trillion, which means the rest is equity or wealth, which is why when house prices are going up, they can outbid the pathetic income-only deposits of first home buyers because they've got this juicy leveraged equity. It's worth underlining this process. If you own a home and the value of that goes up by 20%, which historically in New Zealand happens about every 3 years, banks would lend you enough money to buy another house. Government could have judo chopped this shit ages ago, but they haven't. They could have said investors need to stump up a deposit of 100% to buy a property, like the Opportunities Party is currently campaigning on. Or they could have put in a tax on property, again, like the Opportunities Party is currently campaigning on with their land tax, or land value tax. But they didn't. In 1987, Labour scrapped it because they were too busy fucking everything else up, and then Cullen called it political suicide, and then Jacinda said that people expect their property to go up, and that a CGT, a capital gains tax, was off the table while she was leader. And now National, ACT, want to roll back all of the good little small things that Labour's been able to do to make property investment not such a terrible hungus in New Zealand. And so today, we've inculcated the state having a low role in the housing market, but we haven't got anywhere near enough state houses, and the private market is building homes for the rich and for property investors. They are not building affordable houses because there's no money in building affordable houses. They're building big homes for existing property owners to use all the equity that they've got over the last few decades. New Zealand still likes to think of itself as a nice place with progressive taxes and universal healthcare, and we get a lot of that sentiment from the build-up of social welfare that happened around the late 1930s and 40s. But even then we were a divided society. Māori and non-Europeans were marginalised, and women were treated as inferior. But the whole progressive society thing, New Zealand was only a leader here up until about 1949. And then we started our long journey of protecting vested interests and the status quo by making everything privatised and opaque and expensive. And in New Zealand, that basically means protecting land prices so the rich stay rich. But let's remember the only good thing the poisonous goober Milton Friedman contributed: that times of crisis make the politically impossible politically inevitable. Crises made income tax everything. Crisis created space for the welfare state, and crisis created the opportunity to destroy it. There are going to be crises coming thick and fast in our rapidly warming world. The Auckland floods and Cyclone Gabrielle's destruction are early examples. It is critical to make sure that the right ideas are lying around to permanently sort New Zealand's housing out. But first, we need to remember that everyone deserves a warm, safe home, and that there are way better, more productive ways to make money than tipping it all into property.